We're continuing now with audio 2. Let's take a look at slide number 9. So needless to say, that didn't work out very well. As I wrote on slide 8, the Dalai Lama didn't change his position from the Simla conference, and unfortunately, there was fighting that broke out between the two sides, which was largely the fault of the Tibetans, but there it was. In 1930, all the way to 32, the Yangtze River, the great east-west waterway, forms a border way upstream between Tibet, the Tibetan Autonomous Region, and the rest of the area, which is now Sichuan province. Way upstream there, in a place where it goes north-south. You can find this on the map, and it's flowing southwards, as I recall. Anyway, on the eastern shore of the Drichu, or the Yangtze River, Drichu in Tibetan, that's where the fighting took place, and the Tibetans lost. They were driven back. So, of course, there weren't very good feelings on either side, and that meant that things didn't progress. Anyway, the next thing that happened, of course, was that the Dalai Lama died, and when Chiang Kai-shek heard about this, now you have to remember we're in the middle of the nationalist decade. The communists are on the run, or they're about to go on the run anyway. Chiang Kai-shek is about to initiate the 5th annihilation campaign. He figures he's got them cornered, and they won't be such a problem anymore. So, having heard of the death of the Dalai Lama, he sends a mission to Tibet, headed this time not by a young lady, but I mean, this is China after all, but by an older Chinese man who happens to be a general. Huang Musong was the head now of this Office of Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs, and his ostensible mission was to offer condolences on the death of the 13th Dalai Lama. He brought lots of gifts, lots of money. He went around to all of the holy places that if you go to Lhasa today, you will see the pilgrims from the countryside circumambulating the city and visiting all these places, holy spots where there are holy relics, and he acted like he was a pilgrim, and banged his head on the floor in all the right places, so to speak. I'm being a little bit cynical, but this is literally what he was doing. And there was a reason for this, because the Tibetans had always wanted any Chinese delegation to Lhasa to be headed up by a true believer, a true Buddhist, who would recognize the religious authority of the Dalai Lama. And so that's what he was doing. He was being a true believer. It was a very important part of his trip. So for the first 2 weeks he's there, his meetings with the Tibetan side are very cordial, and they're very observant of the Dalai Lama's death. And he doesn't really get down to the meat of the matter, if you will, which is bringing Tibet back into the Republic, until he's been there, I think, almost 3 weeks. He makes offers to the Tibetan side, and these offers come in the form of, I think it's 10 points. Here we are. No, it wasn't 10 points on his side. It was a whole lot more points. It was 14 points. And the answers given by the Tibetan side, after much debate in the National Assembly, there was a counter proposal. And their counter proposal was to say things like, in dealing with external affairs, Tibet shall remain an integral part of the territory of China, but the Chinese must promise that they will not change the administration of Tibet into a province. Tibet will listen to whatever China says with regard to such things as external or internal authority and laws, regulations, etc., provided they do not harm the Tibetan dual religious secular government. In other words, don't try to replace the Dalai Lama with a Chinese governor. Only one representative of the Chinese government may be stationed in Tibet, but his retinue shall not exceed 25. This representative must be a true believer in Buddhism. A replay of the old idea. The route taken by a new representative and his retinue must be by sea and not through Kham, which is where Sichuan is today. And the reason for this was entirely military. The Tibetans did not want... This was, of course, the age before the internet, satellite communications, satellite observation. The Tibetans did not have an aircraft. They did not even have a wireless set. There was not one radio in Tibet at this time. So they did not want travel back and forth between Tibet and China by an official representative to become confused with maybe a Chinese invasion, which would come through Sichuan. That's the only route, really, in and out of Tibet. That's at that time, anyway. So that's why they wanted this Chinese delegate to come through India. And so this is interesting because this counterproposal showed an inherent inconsistency of the policy of the late Dalai Lama. Since 1912, Tibet had agreed on some occasions to be part of China in some sort of subordinate status, and at other times had argued that it was independent. And China listened carefully to all these things and advanced when they could and retreated when they needed to. But the bottom line in all of this was that in 1934, in spite of the fact that Chiang Kai-shek had the communists on the run, they, of course, broke out during this period in October of 1934. While Huang Musung was there, the communists broke out and began the Long March. And the Long March came through that area of Kham, or Sichuan, and passed through Tibetan territory. And so this delayed his departure at one point because he didn't want to run into them. However, he managed to leave behind a radio operator and an administrative officer. I think there were only 3 people left behind, but they were later supplemented with others. And this was the beginning of a Chinese presence in Tibet on an official level, flying the flag of the Republic of China that had been absent for 22 years. Not since 1912, I think, had the Chinese had any representation in Tibet. And so this was a very important signal of the decline of Tibetan independence. Let's go on to slide 10. So the British were paying attention because, again, they did not want anything except a nice, weak buffer state on the northern border of their jewel in the crown of their vast Indian empire. So they made certain that they made themselves available, and the regent, our gentleman Ruting, in between whatever else he was doing to fill his pockets with gold and and so on, invited the British to come to Lhasa. They sent an enhanced mission, which the Tibetans were happy to have. They forgave a very large debt for arms sales that had existed for 2 decades. And they sent a military observer, one Brigadier Neem, to inspect the Tibetan troops, to assess the situation. And there are pictures I've posted under course content. You can find a link to a set of photographs that come out of that period. And so the British try to come back in as much force as was allowed. Of course, they didn't end up stationing people in Tibet or anything like that. I mean, any military force, but they were able to beef up their mission in Lhasa. Now, in the meantime, the Panchen Lama, who was exiled in China, was doing his best to figure out a way to come back to Lhasa because he knew the Dalai Lama was dead. If he managed to return, he would be the senior religious official in Tibet, and that might mean a possibility at ultimate power. And the Chinese were very happy about this because, of course, they could use the Panchen Lama to gain advantage themselves in Tibet and try to get rid of the British. There was an old argument at the base of this. The Panchen Lama was secondary in seniority to the Dalai Lama, and for many decades there had been this argument back and forth where the Panchen Lama, who was based traditionally in Shigatse in the south, you can find this on the maps I've given you up till now, near Nepal. The Panchen Lama wanted to possess his own military force, and he wanted to rule the entire region around Shigatse. The Dalai Lama's position was always, no, you may not have your own military force. You must pay a lot of money every year to help me keep up my military force. And besides that, you can run the Tashilumpo monastery where you're based, but that's the limit of your authority. You may not have authority outside the monastery. So there was this rivalry, and the Chinese duly tried to take advantage of this. They actually sent him back toward Tibet anyway, with a military escort. There was a lot of back and forth and stalling between the Tibetans and the Chinese about this. The party never crossed the Drichu or the Yangtze River and entered Tibet proper, however. 2 things intervened. One was war with Japan, and the other was the Panchen Lama dying of illness on the 1st of December 1937. You may recall the war with Japan began in July of 1937. And so that didn't pan out for China. In the meantime, going on to slide 11. In the meantime, back in Lhasa, there was finally agreement about dispatching search teams to 3 different parts of Tibet according to the readings of the oracles who prayed and did other things that brought about supernatural indications of where the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama might be. And they dispatched teams to 3 different places. There was a group of people around Reting and other conservatives who thought they had already identified a young man in Lhasa itself, who would, of course, be under their influence. But that didn't happen. The team that went up into Amdo, or present Qinghai province, to a place called Taxe, found a suitable candidate. And the way they did this was they knew where to go. They went around to different households, and they would bring belongings of the 13th Dalai Lama with them. They'd have something that really did belong to the 13th Dalai Lama, such as a set of prayer beads, and they'd have an almost identical set that did not belong to the Dalai Lama. They would show this to the child in question and see which one the kid grabbed. And there were all sorts of little things like this, what the child would say in response to questions and so forth. However, this area was not controlled by the Tibetan government. It was controlled by the Chinese warlord in Xinjiang named Ma Pufang. Ma Pufang was ostensibly with the Chinese Republic, but he was very independent. And when he found out that the 14th Dalai Lama had been identified on his territory, he sent troops to the area and said, "I would be happy to escort the Dalai Lama back to Tibet. Let's do it." But the authorities in Lhasa feared that this would turn into a Chinese invasion. So they wouldn't agree, and as a fallback position in his negotiating strategy, Ma Pufang demanded 300,000 silver dollars, and it's this kind of coinage you see here. The U.S. trade dollar was a really big thing in China back then, and there were also Chinese silver dollars, many of which had the image of Yuan Shikai as a fat old man on the obverse. Anyway, not only did Ma Pufang want a packet of cash to let the Dalai Lama go, the people in the local monastery, who for a while housed the delegation from Lhasa and the Dalai Lama himself, once they had taken the kid and the family and gotten them ready to go, these people in this monastery decided they would hold them all prisoner and ask for basically what amounted to a ransom themselves. And this should give you an idea of the priorities of the people involved, even if they were frocked monks. The identification of the Dalai Lama was obviously a gigantic opportunity for everybody. And it was very clear that everybody would try to take advantage of it. So the negotiations to get the Dalai Lama out of Qinghai and bring him back to Lhasa, where he could be enthroned, lasted for more than a year. Things didn't work very quickly in those days, probably because there was so much money involved, but also because, of course, again, the key thing about this time of history is how long everything took compared to today. Although I guess I shouldn't say that if we're thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. They don't go very fast either, do they? Never mind. So it was China's preoccupation now at this time with Japan and Ma's greater interest in money than politics that ultimately saved the day for the Tibetans. They managed to find a way to pay this money in a method that would not lead them to be suckered into making more payments. They made a one-time payment of 300,000 silver dollars through a third party, and the Dalai Lama was allowed to travel. So, going on to slide 15, slide 12. In sum, the 1934 defeat of Longshar and his horrible fate was a warning to anybody who had progressive or liberal ideas. That was the first strike, if this were baseball. The return of the Chinese mission was no help either. Reting Rinpoche, getting caught breaking his vows and being such a corrupt individual in the first place, and his later attempt to come back in a coup, causing a brief civil war, also added to the instability of the situation. And there were a couple successes, but the problem with these successes that we just went over, stopping the Panchen Lama from returning and securing the new Dalai Lama, really did no more than give a false sense of security and maybe protection from heaven, that sort of thing. People always think that. And the main factor really that saved the Tibetans during this time was that the KMT was simply too distracted and ultimately too weak to invade. Looking at slide 13, so these things happening just came before the end of colonialism in that part of the world. The only remnants of colonialism in East Asia after this were the French in Indochina, the British in Malaya, but the rest of it all went by the wayside. In 1947, the British were forced out of India and Pakistan, and there was the rise of the United States in East Asia, which represented a much greater threat to the communist Chinese as they were getting ready to take power than the British had been, because the British, of course, were a declining power at this time of history. The advent of modern transport and armaments, not to mention the atom bomb, made control of China's periphery seem more urgent and important than it had been in the past, and so there was no longer any reason, particularly with the unification of China, for the new Chinese government that came into power in 1949 from considering any independent or semi-independent or autonomous Tibet option at all. No way. It was necessary to secure Tibet in their view because there had been so many foreign threats in the past, and the hand of the British, perhaps through the Indians and perhaps using the Americans as well, was such a threat that they wanted to make sure they secured Tibet for the geopolitical reasons as well that we've discussed previously. So this made it rather inevitable that once the communists took power, that they would turn their attention toward, as they put it, liberating Tibet. We'll stop here and go on to slide 14 and 15.